current hydro and chair of flow. Before I get going, I'm going to pass it along to our other flow leaders on the call to introduce themselves. Kyle.
Hey, my name is Kyle Weiss. I am a hydropower engineer at the Pacific Northwest National Lab.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anton Hasselbrook. I'm a mechanical engineer for Central Nebraska Public Power.
Thanks, guys. So now, if this is your first flow call, we would love to know who you are. Feel free to either unmute yourself, drop it in the chat, just your name, organization, and region that you're working from. No pressure to say anything more than that, but just want to give everyone a chance to say hello. Any new folks?
Hi, yes, my name's Pat Meeks. I'm with the Hydropower Hydrokinetic Office at the DOE. I'm on the marine energy team, and I'm a data analyst located out of Phoenix, Arizona. Yeah, and I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
Thanks for joining, Pat.
Sure. I'm Benjamin Coleman out of Boston, Massachusetts. Work for Dantas. I know you, Haley. How you been?
Good to see you, Ben.
Nice to see you there. I work in hydropower, largely in fish protection.
Thanks for joining, Ben.
Hi, I'm Christina Chu. I'm an assistant emergency manager at Tacoma Power up in Washington State. I got this from one of our comms people here at the utility, so happy to be here.
Happy to have you, Christina. Anyone else? All right. So hearing none, just a couple quick housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded, and our recording is then posted to the flow page in the NHA portal afterwards. And you can feel free to drop any questions in the chat as we go along, but we have a dedicated Q&A section at the end of the meeting. So a few announcements before we get started. Coming up on Monday, August 24th is National Hydropower Day. So this is an opportunity for flow members to get visible on social media. Go ahead and post about your accomplishments in the industry, your career story, or what led you to the hydropower field in the first place. NHA has put together a social media toolkit to make this easy for you. Kelly is dropping this link into the chat, and this year's theme is Hydropower works. So feel free to use that theme to speak to how hydropower works for communities, to lower electricity costs, to firm up the grid, etc., or simply post with hashtag Hydro Day. We'd love to see everyone show up for the industry on Monday. Next up, mark your calendars for the Early Career Professionals Networking event at Clean Currents. This will be held Wednesday, September 23rd at 7:30 p.m. at Champaign Lanes. We encourage all our 40-year-old and under colleagues to join us for the event. But if you're not in that range and are new to the hydropower industry, just reach out to Kelly and we will get you on the list. It's a ticket event, so if you plan on attending Clean Currents, make sure that you add the networking event when you register. It's going to be a fun night. We have beverages, bowling, and billiards. And it's a great chance to meet new flow colleagues or reconnect with familiar faces. I hope to see you there. Also at Clean Currents, the Hydropower Foundation will be hosting a career expo for students at a local university. And I'm going to hand this over to Jenna to share more on that.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jenna, for those of you who don't know me. I work with Kelly on Flow, but I also work at the Hydropower Foundation. So just a quick announcement about a great volunteer opportunity for those of you who will be at Clean Currents in Phoenix in September, or for those of you who are just in the Phoenix area. The Hydropower Foundation is hosting its second Power Your Future Career Expo at Arizona State University on Tuesday, September 22nd from 1:30 to 4 p.m. It's happening alongside Clean Currents, which means it's a great chance for us to connect with local students who are exploring careers in renewable energy. We are looking for volunteers to get involved as representatives of either their organizations or their career disciplines. So I'll explain the two ways that you could volunteer. The first is one of the tracks is career exploration. So this is where you represent your specific career discipline and talk with students about your career path. So how you got where you are, what a day in your role looks like, that kind of thing. We're looking for representatives in the 9 career disciplines that we've defined. So that ranges from admin and HR to data science and cybersecurity to engineering to project management, legal also. And the second option is career ready. So this is more of a table setup for your company where you talk about open positions and what the company does, and less about your personal career journey, more about the company itself. And this option works especially well if you've got a few people from your team who want to take part. So if this sounds interesting to you, or if you just want to learn more and learn more about the foundation and how you can get involved, just find me. You can email me at jenna@hydro.org. You can drop your name in the chat and say, I'm interested, and I'll reach out to you. So yeah, we'd love to have you represent us at the Career Expo. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Jenna. And one more announcement. Mark your calendars for Flow's last in-person meetup of the year, and this is happening in Nashville, Tennessee, December 9th to 10th. The NHA Southeast Regional Meeting. If you live or work in the Southeast region, we'd love to see you there and help you connect with fellow Flow Southeast professionals. All right, now on to today's topic. Hybrid work is something nearly all of us are navigating in some form, whether we're leading teams, doing the work ourselves, or managing relationships with clients and partners across time zones and screens. So I'm excited to introduce Shoni Britton, Director of Employee Development, Equity, and Belonging at Seattle City Light. Shoni brings decades of experience in organizational development, workforce training, and employee engagement, including extensive work across the federal government and military. She's going to walk us through exactly how to be an effective hybrid professional in any role. Shoni, take it away.
Well, hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for that intro, Haley. Just a little bit extra about me. So I've worked, as she said, in the military, defense acquisitions, foreign military sales, USAID, USDA, US Forest Service, and now in the energy industry. And what I can say is across all of those industries, there are some truths that are universal and some skills that translate across any field. And so a couple of those lessons are things that I will be sharing today. Back in, I want to say February, I had a chance to present at the Northwest Hydropower Association conference on this topic, but from a management perspective and management responsibility. But today it's really going to be focused on how to thrive as a hybrid teammate, and both at the individual contributor level, but also at any level. And I think that that's a really important skill set. A lot of people think the burden is on the people leaders in helping create equitable spaces in the hybrid environment and other things. And it is, but everyone has agency and control and influence more than they maybe give themselves credit for. So it'll be really focused on the things that are in this space for anyone, and no matter where they sit organizationally. So with that, I will bring up my slide deck, and someone could let me know if that is showing for you.
It's
Okay,
showing.
awesome.
We can see it. Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we'll get started. I can barely see you. I guess I have a little square. So if there are hands, I'm happy to take some questions in the middle if somebody has them. But also we have a whole section at the end, and there'll be some points where I'll ask you to do a little bit of reflection. And if you want to throw those thoughts into the chat pod, happy to have that be a way of engagement. So with that, I would say that, we really hope that by today we're clarifying some expectations and working norms for hybrid teams, talk about how to make work progress visible without performing presence, and choosing some common communications practices to reduce friction and increase clarity, the importance of emotional intelligence in an effective hybrid environment, and then how to build equity, belonging, and resilience into everyday team habits. So one thing that I think is important is that, hybrid work has changed fundamentally the way that we build trust as teams, exchange information, and like the whole decision-making process. And so I really hone in on 5 foundations of how to really build that effective environment. And it requires more intentionality and being more deliberate in a lot of our actions. And while at the end of the day, I will 100% say that having worked 5 days a week in office or on ship for over a decade, having ad hoc telework, being fully remote for 6 years in the federal sector to now being 3 days in office, 2 days at home, I've run the whole gamut. I believe the benefits of hybrid work far outweigh the costs, but there are some trade-offs, and there is a higher need for intentionality. And so those 5 foundations are around structural clarity, communication discipline. I know that sounds intense, discipline, but emotional intelligence, equity by design, and intentional community building. And so with structural clarity, hybrid work has created less room for assumptions. And people need to know when we're available, how quickly we're expected to respond, where decisions get made, and where information lives in our ecosystem. Clarity, that might happen organically when people or everyone is together, has to become much more intentional. In hybrid teams, communication is more than, it's not about more is more, or more is needed. It's around how deliberate it is. So, where are we housing decisions? How accessible is communication? Do we have shared workspaces? All of that kind of stuff, and we'll go into that a little bit more. In terms of emotional intelligence, technology can carry our words, but it doesn't always carry tone, intent, context, which is key in all environments. Hybrid teammates have to be particularly good at checking their assumptions. If anyone's ever been in a leadership development program and talked about that ladder of inference where you climb on up and make assumptions, and next thing you know, you're in a different space. Well, you got to kind of check those assumptions and learn to read the room. And sometimes reading a virtual room can be really challenging. So knowing when a conversation needs to move from chat or email to an actual face-to-face dialogue is super important. And sometimes that does need to happen. Human conversation can't be underestimated. Equity by design. Hybrid can create 2 really different employee experiences if we aren't careful. One for the people who are physically present and another for everyone else. And so equity by design means like asking whether people have comparable access to information, participation, visibility, opportunities, and influence, regardless of where they happen to be sitting. We'll talk a little bit about proximity bias later. That isn't always, actually more often than not, is not malicious, but can unintentionally happen. And finally, intentional community building. When we all worked in the same place all the time, connection could happen by accident. You walk into a meeting and you had a hallway conversation, grabbing a coffee, the chit chat before the meeting even starts, which does still sometimes happen in a hybrid environment, but it can take a different flavor. And sometimes those accidental moments of connection are are taken away in that environment. And so really being intentional about how you build community. And like I said before, none of these are solely a supervisor's responsibility. Every one of us has influence in how we show up as a teammate. So before we get into practical experiences and behaviors, I'd love to think about your own. And, in the chat pod, if you wanted to share, what have you noticed that is harder in a hybrid environment that maybe was different from your past experience. So if you guys wanted to reflect on that, and I'll keep going. So one of the biggest points is that clarity is a team sport. Hybrid breaks down very quickly when expectations live in people's heads and not on paper or in some shared known norm. So great teammates have an opportunity. They know core hours. When are people available? What are the norms around response times? So I've had a ton of experiences where I've worked with teams, gone in and facilitated their, team building experiences, and the manager thought everyone knew exactly what was expected, and it turned out I got 9 different answers on like how quickly they were expected to respond, what did out of office messages need to say, how all of those types of things. So creating those norms and having everybody explicitly know them is a huge deal. Following those shared meeting norms. So what needs to be a meeting? What can be a chat? When are things needing to escalate? All of those different questions. Capturing those decisions in shared spaces. So there is nothing worse than the meeting that happens after the meeting as people are walking out that change the dynamic of what was decided. And so that's, we had my first CEO at Seattle City Light was like, no, we're going to have the meeting in the meeting. And I had a great appreciation for that message. Also, it becomes increasingly important to ask rather than assume. And I mentioned assumptions a little earlier, but that piece around, there is no dumb question except for the one that you didn't ask. So if you're unclear, there's strong likelihood other people are unclear as well. And so I think that that's, super important. So if you think of your own team that you're on, whether you're leading it or you're an individual contributor, if you really asked, do we all have the same understanding of what's expected of us? So for any recurring pattern, can everyone answer on your team when you're expected to be available? Where does the information live? What requires a meeting versus that asynchronous work? How are decisions documented? And if you were to ask your peers and your manager these questions and they're not the same, then giving a little bit of intentional time to developing those norms and putting them on paper and making sure you're onboarding people with those norms and everything else can really pay off. So another piece that I think is super important, and one of the trickier realities of hybrid work is that when we don't see people working, and this has been, there are differences across generations around some of this, but when we don't see people working, it can sometimes be harder to see the work. But yet those are really two very different things. And I mentioned earlier that term proximity bias. And so if you've never heard that term before, it's basically the tendency for people who are physically closer or simply more visible to be more readily noticed. And the evidence and the research on this is pretty clear. They're more likely to get promotional opportunities, to get developmental opportunities, to be asked their opinion. And so as I said earlier, it's not a malicious thing. It's just like any other unconscious bias. You have to really be conscious of it. And that's, the lack of malicious nature attached to it is why we have to pay such close attention to things like that. And so, leaders absolutely have a responsibility in managing this, but we also have a responsibility as teammates as well. And the answer isn't to prove that we're sitting at a computer 8 hours a day. The answer is to make work appropriately visible. And what does that mean? What is appropriately visible? Communicating progress proactively. Don't make someone come looking for you to find out where something stands, especially if they're codependent or reliant on whatever it is you're working on. Don't make people guess. A short, useful update can alleviate a lot of uncertainty. Focus visibility on deliverables and what's being accomplished. not how many hours your bubble is green. And so what did we agree would happen, and where are we against that specific commitment? That's what you should be focused on. This is a very similar lesson to what I say to managers, like manage for outcomes, not for visibility, because they're not the same thing. That responsibility runs surfacing blockers early. This one's huge. One of my personal mantras is bad news does not get better with time. It often just gets more expensive. So if something's preventing you from delivering, raising it early isn't failure. It gives the team an opportunity to solve the problem while there's still time to do something about it. And so that's super important. And then finally, that appropriate visibility thing again, and the key word of being appropriate, like what do I mean by that? I don't want anybody leaving here thinking that they need to like send their supervisor a play-by-play or their peers a play-by-play of their day. That's definitely, please don't. I don't want that as a team manager, but visibility should be useful. It should help people understand progress, know where where you're waiting for decisions, coordinate the work, and offer help. There's an important line between visibility, though, and performative busyness. So what do I mean by that? Hybrid work shouldn't require us to constantly prove that we're working. What we want is that the people who depend on our work aren't left guessing. And so that's kind of that same point I was making earlier. So when you think about your own personal work, like how can you show progress before somebody even has to ask? So maybe it's a quick project update. Maybe it's keeping a shared tracker actually up to date. Wouldn't that be amazing? Documenting milestones, using whatever project planning tools you use. There's no single right answer, but the goal is to make the outcome visible, not the activity related to the outcome visible. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so this is a model that I think is useful for all updates, and that's the 4 questions. What's done, or what's moving forward, or to the next step? What's happening next? If things are blocked, what needs help or a decision in order to move forward, and by when? So time bound is an incredibly important thing. So, when should people be expecting? What's the timing associated with things? Those are really important. That line at the bottom, visibility should create coordination, not surveillance. I think it's never ceases to amaze me that I still have to work with people leaders every day on, as long as the outcomes are coming, that's what's important. As long as there's, fairness in the applicability of it. So the next one is around that communication discipline, and I do believe that it equates to team success. So hybrid communication, works best, as I mentioned, when it's really intentional about both the channels and the documentation. So using document first shared space workflows. And so what I mean by that is whenever possible, put information somewhere the team can actually find it again, and that it's an agreed upon spot. If it only exists in my inbox or a chat between me and one other person, essentially nobody has access to it. So it might as well never have happened from a decision legacy standpoint. So that's super important. What's your single source of truth? And so if a team needs to know where's the authoritative version control is a huge problem in the hybrid space. So we communicate in a lot of different places, but like when you need the real one that is the shareable document to whomever, where can we agree that source of truth is? The goal isn't, one communication tool. The goal is having the team understand how we use the tools and agree upon that. And so escalation paths, if something is urgent or time sensitive or requires a decision now and it's going to stop the team from moving forward, what are those agreed upon escalation paths? Where does it go? What's that strategy? Having those conversations before a crisis or an escalation need is really important to making sure that happens smoothly when it's supposed to. Prepare. Here's the thing. Synchronous time together, and what I mean by that is like actual live interactive time, is so precious in a hybrid environment that you need to come prepared and make it valuable. So coming with what people need from you, what's changed, and discovering, if that's the time for collaborative brainstorming or whatever it is, have expectations around what that space is going to be. There's nothing worse than having everybody walk out and be like, man, that could have been an email. Protect one-on-ones. I think this is super important in hybrid environments because that's where really that deep dive, collaborative thought partnership space should be. If you're only using your one-on-ones to deliver like programmatic updates, that really could be an email. And so I as a, director really appreciate when people come like to those one-on-ones with like the wicked things, like what are your challenges? How can we work through it? My job's not to, do the work, but it is to remove barriers and help work through some of those things. And finally, when something's unclear, and I mentioned this before, I cannot say clarity is kindness. And if you have the question, other people will too. So a 5-minute clarification today can prevent 5 days of people working from different assumptions and then coming back together and realizing you're in totally different spaces. So super important there. So the common thread across all 6 of these is that good hybrid communication makes people go hunting less, guess less, and repeat themselves less. So really think about, in terms of your own team for a couple seconds, like if everyone asked where the source of information of truth is, would people give the same answer? So if they wouldn't, or if the answer it depends or whatever, it's not a punitive thing, but it is a good diagnostic piece of data on whether or not everyone really has the communication discipline to be successful in that space. All right. So emotional intelligence. Oh man, buzz terms. But I actually firmly believe, and I have total other courses dedicated to this topic, but emotional intelligence is your career superpower. And it does travel across streams if you are self-aware and understand how to read other people's cues. It can really magnify those interpersonal gaps because context and nonverbal cues are harder to read and they're thinner. So you have to really be dedicated to things like managing conflict before it festers and gets past it. That piece around like, we need to have the emotional maturity to be like, okay, I'm going to not presume that I know that what the tone was supposed to be. Give humble inquiry and genuine curiosity into like what's actually happening. Small misunderstandings can surprisingly get big when we allow them to sit and don't just ask for that clarity on what's actually happening. So if something sounds abrupt or, somebody doesn't respond right away, again, don't climb that ladder of inference. Don't create up a story about why. That'll keep you up at night. Just ask that clarifying question right off the bat. Choose curiosity before conclusion. That ability to give and receive feedback. Feedback is even more important when we aren't working side by side every day. We've got to be able to tell one another what's working, what isn't, and, honestly, like, what do you need? No one is going to take care of your career, of your needs more than you will. And if you don't communicate them, people aren't mind readers. I can't tell you the number of times I've had somebody say like, I thought you knew. And I'm like, how would I have known? And they're like, that's a good point. And so, that ability to open those doors. And yes, on the manager side, creating that psychological safety to make it a space where people can ask questions and can raise concerns is super important, but psychological safety goes both ways. And finally, that staying curious across different work styles and generations. That does mean sometimes we have to put our own, personal preferences aside and, meet people where they're at. I think investment in teams across kind of understanding different people's communication styles. So like my team has done DISC, we've done Enneagram, we've done a lot of those communication style preferences and conflict style preferences, TKIs, conflict styles, just to kind of understand like, okay, this is how I need to pivot my way to understand where they're coming from a little bit more. So, emotional intelligence comes down to this in the hybrid environment. Like when you have less context, don't compensate with assumptions, compensate with more curiosity. So, all right. I think we can all probably think of a time when we completely misinterpreted somebody's intent and that probably could have been avoided with a clarifying question. All right. So in terms of the feedback that I just talked about giving and receiving, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the Birch model for performance feedback, but it stands for behavior, impact, restore or repair or whatever it is, and then the consequence, and then the help. Like, what am I going to do to help you? But this is better this model is better in terms of like peer-to-peer feedback. And that's around, naming the situation, the specific time or behavior. I cannot tell you enough how important it is to name with specificity, the impact on you or the team or the work, and then the next step. That next step is super important. And when we say a workable request, it's not like, it's sort of like in the terms of reasonable accommodation. It has to be a reasonable accommodation, still has to be reasonable. A workable request has to be, keyword, workable. So they just like the example, when the decision that you made after the meeting with only the in-office group, I missed that context and then ended up having to redo the work. Could we capture follow-up decisions in this specified channel moving forward? It doesn't have to be a big ask, it doesn't have to be combative or defensive so much as just focus on the impact of what happened and what would help correct. Okay, so equity by design. Equal access does not happen automatically in a mixed location, but I also think it's really important to understand that like equitable doesn't necessarily mean equal either. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but as terms of, bringing remote participants fully into the conversation, especially if not everyone is remote at all times. So if there's people in a conference room and there's people on the screen, having to be really intentional about like, hey, what do you think? Hey, what do you think? Avoid those side conversations that can exclude if you're like in the corner, chatting about something or passing notes back and forth that are relative to the meeting, Sometimes that's really tempting to do, but it also can feel incredibly exclusionary to those who aren't in the space. Rotating visible meeting roles, so who facilitates, who schedules the agenda, who does all of those things, including sometimes people who are on the screen and not in the room, being the ones who guide and lead those conversations. Sharing the opportunities openly, and that's opportunities to provide input, that's opportunities for developmental assignments or special projects, all of those types of things. And then finally, noticing who is stretched and who's overlooked. So what I have seen happen in the past, unintentionally, is that, a director will walk out of their office and the first cube that they see is their person that they know and they go to, and the next thing you know, that person's gotten 4 extra assignments while somebody's online wondering, how can I help? What am I doing? Why don't I have any work? And so really being intentional about, tracking the workloads and being adaptable. So here's just a quick checklist around hybrid meeting equity. So before, make sure using agendas, by the way, that's super, super important. Make them accessible to everyone, remote participation, same, preparation time, other things during the meeting, one conversation at a time, use shared, use shared digital artifacts. And what I mean by that is like materials. So for instance, I shared with Haley, or with Jenna rather, ahead of this meeting, both the slide deck and the tip sheet that I'm going to leave behind for you guys so that everyone will have access to all of the materials. Also invite voices without putting people on the spot. So you don't necessarily need to name them, but maybe name different roles or open the floor in general. And then that piece around documenting your decisions and making sure that things are in the same spot. So just a few things to check yourself. Okay. All right. So this goes back to that intentional community building and community and belonging being actual practices and behaviors that build connections. So it's easier to lose when, contact is uneven. So when you do have in-person opportunities, really participate fully and purposefully in those moments. Celebrate wins consistently across locations. So if you have an award ceremony or some sort of potluck or things, make sure that the people who are either fully remote or hybrid also have an opportunity to celebrate in that. And whether it's the exact same activity or some other form, there's a lot of different ways to do it. But it's important to make sure that that's, for instance, at Seattle City Light, we have most of our staff is Seattle based, but we do have 2 hydroelectric generation facilities in Skagit and Boundary across the state of Washington. And so making sure that, when we did a big family day recently with huge events and catering and all the things, we also had family day celebrations at Boundary and Skagit. And we went up, our employee engagement team, and also connected with them there so that they felt, that they were also a part of the utility. Welcome new hires deliberately. The first 90 days that somebody comes on board in your organization, evidence bears that is really the moment where they make the decision if I'm in this for the long haul or if I'm going to start looking for the exit. Culture is according to Gallup's 2025 research, you are 4 times more likely to leave a job for culture than you are for pay. And if you leave for pay, you might come back for culture, but if you leave for culture, you ain't never coming back for pay. And the evidence is very clear on that. So those types of things are super important. And then finally, that piece around really investing in mentorship and cross-site relationships. I think, and especially in a hybrid environment, finding mentoring and peer coaching is like building those kinds of pipelines within the organization, and reach out to your employee engagement team, because if they don't already have something like that, it might be a great thing to build and practice. I swear I'm getting close to the end here. All right, so finally, I think hybrid work is going to keep changing. So with the advent of AI, in the federal sector, we had a big change about 2 years ago, 18 months ago, that, sometimes the policies ebb and flow, and just being adaptable and able to, sort of keep asking what the work needs. I think that line at the bottom around resilience is not silent endurance. It's, asking what the work needs, also asking what you need. I think that regulating of the workload and communicating capacity is super important in these environments, because sometimes if you're not, physically present, people can't tell that you're underwater. Raising that ambiguity early. So, like I said, bad news doesn't get better with time, but also, you can't live in an environment where people are guessing. That ability to work iteratively and adaptively, I think, in land management, they used to talk about adaptive management. But I think that that's super, super important still. And, getting tied to any one way of doing things these days with the tools constantly changing is, I think, resilience and adaptability are probably the 2 biggest skill sets that I think that our workforce needs moving forward. But I also know that if you are a people leader, for instance, one of the things I've learned is that people can handle uncertainty if there is transparency on what we do know and what we don't know, and how they'll hear it when they do. And then finally, that piece around escalation and crisis continuity protocols, the time for developing those kinds of tools is not when you need them. It's on the front end. So back to the designing for equity of experience, the 4 questions that I think are really important are: who has access, who has visibility, who's stretched, and who's overlooked. So again, it doesn't mean equal in terms of everyone has to work the same way and have the same experience, but it does mean that, your location shouldn't determine what access you do or don't have to information, to contributions, opportunities, and recognition. So a couple key takeaways. Do not sell your personal agency and influence, or don't sell it short, in terms of, I think a lot of people think that they are like, we have this equation in our workplace expectations training around my experience plus my choice equals my reality. And what that means is you may not have control, you may have influence because of the situations you put yourself in, but you don't have control over what happens to you, but you 100% have control of how you react to it. And that's what creates your reality. And so you really can, as an individual contributor, shape the information flow, what level of inclusion, what trust you give and receive, and your sense of belonging every day. I think one of the other things that I think is super important is avoiding that idea of treating remote work or office work as inherently better, especially in our world, in this industry. Like there's going to be people who inherently have to be in the field or at the office more than others. And so that goal should be really focused on intentional coordination across locations, not around demonizing one or the other. Also, personal preferences are not the same thing as team norms or like agreed upon norms. And so if you have a personal preference, that's great to communicate it, and hopefully that can be adapted into your team norms. But a team norm is something that is explicit, shared, understood, and most times written down. And so that's super important. I think reiterating the visibility versus performative busyness, useful progress updates, raising those blockers, sharing decisions, focusing on outcomes. Super important. And then finally, that piece, just reiterating one more time that when thinking about equity, it's important to focus on access to information, participation, opportunity, workload, and recognition, and not necessarily identical treatment, because everyone has a different set of needs, different relationship, different working environment. And so with that, I will stop talking and hopefully take some questions or thoughts for discussion. And if folks wanted to turn their cameras on, I wouldn't be opposed to seeing your wonderful faces.
You can feel free to drop it in the chat if you don't want to show yourself on camera. And I think we've got a couple questions to get us started here, Sean. So for someone who's an individual contributor rather than a manager, what is the single most important thing that they can do to stay visible in a hybrid environment?
So I do think that so no one is going to be a greater steward for your career than you. And I think that I actually just had this conversation the other day with someone who said, like, I've been, working so hard, I've been pumping out my things, and I feel unseen. And it wasn't my person, but it was somebody else's. And I was like, well, have you told them that you want to focus your next one-on-one on your own development or your own things? Like, have you taken control of your own opportunities in front of people? And they were like, no, I never thought about doing that. And I was like, okay, great. Well, here's some tips on, I'd like to develop an individual development plan, or I'd like to talk about, here's where I see myself going. How can you help me get there? I think there's also, my teenage daughter tells me I come from a hustle culture background, and I kind of laugh about it because I'm like, okay, that's probably true, but also there is something to be said for raising your hand and keeping, it doesn't, you don't have to raise your hand for every opportunity, but when something sounds interesting, sometimes that proximity bias is not intentional. And so you need to just say, like, hey, I'd really like to be considered for X, Y, and Z as well. Or the next time something like blank comes up, can you please do that? But the most important thing would go back to something I said in the actual presentation, and that's the routine and regular updates. Even if you think people know, putting something in writing and sharing it across your channels about the status, the things that are challenging, and whatever else is, my actual master's degree is in political communication, and people need 7 points of communication to make something stick, which is why you get ads and mailers and telephone calls and all the things. And that's for the simplest of messages. And so really don't underestimate how important regular and routine, just random touch points of communication are, especially in the hybrid environment.
That was great. Appreciate that. So looks like we've got a few more questions. Adam, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Yeah, just wondering, and maybe it just varies by organization. Like you said, maybe these need to be developed, kind of the norms for your team. But being in the office, you can just walk by someone's office, they're around, you can chat and say hi. When it's remote, like, do you find that that certain ways work better. You can like set up a meeting in advance, but then it feels a little more formal. Just calling them out of the blue feels a little rude sometimes. So I don't know what you'd recommend there.
So I think things like coffee chats, or what I used to call campfire chats, where it's just a little bit less formal. And it's an optional time for people to sort of come together. I had one team when we were fully remote in the Forest Service that did weekly trivia, and and it was a lot of laughter. It was like 30, 45 minutes once a week for the team just to have space. And so I think that piece around, obviously you can't make it mandatory, but I've never had a group that scheduled those things and then nobody came. People always showed up and wanted to sort of connect on that level. One of the things that people lament the most to me about yesteryear is the loss of things like happy hour, or like that kind of intentional time. And so you do have to kind of, like, whether it's a lunch together type of thing online, which is very weird. It's funny. I don't know when I became painfully aware of this, but I used to go out to lunch with people all the time, but somehow eating on camera feels way more awkward, even if you turn your camera off. But I think it's just kind of letting go of some of the awkwardness and just manufacturing in the most organic way possible those times to connect. And also, I really believe that even if teams are hybrid or remote, scheduling routine and regular team building time is super important. So like my team does 3 days together, or 2.5 days together, half full half, every 6 months, no matter what. And it's important to me. So I'll, even when I was federal, I was flying people in, we were going to wherever needed to go, because there is some piece of like the evening dinners, the things where you really like talk about whatever it is that are very formative in relationship building. Not every organization is going to be able to do that, but if you do have the ability to, I think it's super important. And you can also do really effective team building stuff virtually as well if you have a gifted facilitator. Like between Mural and all these online collaborative tools, you really can do a lot of stuff together in a virtual space that surprised me, actually, because I was a non-believer 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I'll own it. But then I became a fully remote national director and realized I had to become a believer very quickly.
Right. Thanks.
Mhm.
Kyle, do you have a question?
Yeah, I had a follow-up question. You started talking about conflict, and I wanted to learn a little bit more about what does that look like, and specifically resolving conflict, the differences in the hybrid workspace versus fully in person, and that sort of thing. Because I feel like that's could be very difficult to navigate, especially when you're not in the office with somebody.
Let's be honest, conflict is difficult to navigate for people everywhere. So I have many people sitting right outside my office right now that are long overdue for a little chitty chat with each other, that are avoiding it even in person. So let's not pretend it's not difficult either way. I do think that this is a skill set that is very underinvested in general. And I think that model that I shared around, naming the situation, naming the impact, and then naming what the restorative action or request would be is a pretty simple model to follow. But I also think that piece around investing in like curiosity around what's driving the conflict. I say all the time, get curious, not furious, in the sense of, I think that there's a lot of space for assumptions to be made, and I am as guilty as the next person around that. I've been like, that was kind of curt. And so taking the time to really, regulate yourself first. I said emotional intelligence is a career superpower, and the first two elements of emotional intelligence are self-awareness and self-management. So keep yourself in a space that's like, okay, I'm regulated, I'm ready to ask the questions, I'm ready to actually listen generously and hear where it's coming from. But I think that the piece around one of my other mantras is you can't fix what you can't talk about. And so if you're not willing to put yourself out there to name that there's an issue, then it can't be resolved. And, you know, I tell my kids all the time, if someone's mad at you and they haven't told you, that's a them problem. But I mean, obviously that doesn't work in all situations, but it's trying to be a lesson about like hold your ground, stand in your authority. But no, I think that piece around creating intentional time for it. So the time to address a conflict in my mind is not in a team, obviously not in a team meeting. Going to the person directly. Triangulation is so common in the hybrid workspace, and I mean it's common everywhere. Do you guys, maybe I'll explain if you've not familiar with that triangulation term. What that means is somebody makes you upset, or your boss makes you upset, and rather than tell your boss or the person that made you upset, you go to a peer who then goes to somebody else, and then it triangulates back to them. And so then everybody knows there's a problem, but nobody's actually talking about the problem. And that's where insidious gossip can really spread quickly. And so having the bravery and the courage to name the thing, name it well. So again, follow your models. I also think that people don't prepare adequately generally for when these conversations, and whether that's performance feedback, whether it's interpersonal conflict, taking the time. How you prep is how you perform in general. And so taking a time to jot yourself a little script. And I know that sounds silly, but it really, you don't have to follow it word by word, but the more prepared you feel, the more confident you will feel going into really any situation. And so for what it's worth, that's my 2 cents on that topic.
Thank you.
And I'll throw out a question for our hybrid folks. So how do we, I guess for me, what I was curious about was I have a fully remote team, and we don't have in-person options at all.
Okay.
So some of that community building that you talked about, is that one-on-one? Is that more team building as the team grows together? You have new folks coming on, some of these campfire chats that I think you mentioned, I'm not too familiar with.
Sure. I think it's best in a blend. If you're going to have one-on-one, for instance, if it's peer one-on-ones, I don't think there's a lot of pressure. But if it's, for instance, if there's any sort of power differential, being incredibly clear about this is an informal, like, whatever, because wise people think they're in trouble. And but I think small groups work really well. If it's team and it's really informal, and some of those like coffee chats or whatever else, I think it's fine to offer it to anybody. But I think when it comes to the discussions around, I think at least once every year, if you do quarterly, for instance, check-ins on performance and things, one of them should be solely dedicated to a person's, or a section of each should be solely dedicated to their own growth, development, desires, wants, needs. And so I'm not 100% sure. What I do think is possible is there are some facilitators and other tools. And actually, let's be honest, AI is great for this too right now. If you were to, if you have Copilot or Claude or ChatGPT or whatever, and just say like, I'd like some team building, relationship building exercises that I could do in 20 minutes, in a half day, it'll help you design it. And if you're comfortable in that space, you can really generate a lot of aha moments with your team that and learn things about them that you never thought possible. I think it's also a really good space to surface sort of how people are feeling either utilized or not. I had a virtual retreat a couple years ago where I found out that somebody who was a really great performer, had no problems, but she was a couple layers down in the organization from me, was like bored out of her mind to the point where she was going to be leaving. And I was like, you want some work? I got some work for you. I mean, and not in like a exploitive kind of way, but I'm like, oh, you've done such great work. Like, had I known you had extra capacity, I would have jumped on this long ago. But lots of questions that you can sort of create that space. Also, if you're in those kinds of environments, creating intentional space where they do like pair and or small group breakout discussions and things where they can build relationship with each other is a super effective way of taking some of the pressure off of a large group conversation. I don't know if that helps, but
I think it definitely helped. I appreciate all those recommendations. I think we might have time for one more question. Anyone else on the call with a question? Feel free to share it or drop it in the chat.
I have a quick question on any best practices you're seeing for in-office etiquette when you have a hybrid team, and so you have the in-person folks potentially on remote calls with the remote side of the team, competing for a small amount of shared spaces, things like that. I'm curious if you've seen any best practices in like the etiquette side.
have you been at my office recently? Honestly, okay. So I'm gonna back it up a little bit and say I do feel like COVID fundamentally changed our workplace dynamics in terms of civility in the workplace, but also in terms of how should I say this? I want to say entitlement because that's the wrong word, but personal preferences and what is appropriate for shared spaces. So we actually had to recently institute actual space guidance for how you reserve cubes, what you can have in the space, what is the threshold for where you take it to one of the shared community rooms. And there's some disagreement still in our system around, well, you're asking me to be in the office, but then you're kicking me over here, or all my meetings are on Teams. And I do think that some of the practices around like no meeting days. So for instance, for my team, we have one anchor day on Mondays where everyone is in the office together, and that's when we do our divisional meetings. And that's when we are encouraged to do any of the collaborative work that needs to happen, the real like whiteboarding, ideation type work that would benefit from shared thoughts. And then we had if you're doing job interviews, for instance, you need to move to a private space. So we did have like the discussion of what are all the possible things. And, there's going to be the reality of some people just have, like I have a loud voice because I'm used to projecting and instructing in front of groups. And I just, it is. And so like, what are those, where's the, having honest, open conversations and putting it in writing. There's going to be some gray areas where, if you are bothered by something, you need to take some personal agency and responsibility and go to a different room or do whatever that is. Also, we did have to have some accommodations around like, I need to work on a different floor with a more private space 2 days a week because it's just too distracting and things. And I think there's been a lot of flexibility around that. But having somebody in a position of authority start the conversation around what those shared spaces are. And I mean, we were lucky we had just had a whole redesign of the building, which necessitated that. And we also had a threshold. You didn't get your own cube unless you were in the office 4 days or more a week. Yeah, otherwise it was a shared rotation, but we had a 3-day in office minimum by the mayor. So it's, you kind of have to work through it. But everyone's suffering in silence just doesn't do anybody any good. And so naming the thing, and sometimes it's as simple as going to whomever has authority of the space and being like, I think we would really benefit from discussions around norms on these things. And sometimes that'll go somewhere. Also, if you have an employee advisory group or any sort of group like that, that can help be the voice for that, because that's their role. Those can be really effective. I think our employee advisory group has brought a few things around things that were perceived to be unfair or inequitable to our CEO and our GM, even in the last couple of weeks. So kind of knowing what your resources in your space are is super important in that regard.
That's great. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Also, we're going to do a whole civility in the workplace training soon for the entire utility, because I really think that everybody needs a little bit more of a, hey, remember that time when we all had respect for each other? I'm just kidding. It's not like a terrible thing. I'm just, COVID changed the world.
It certainly did. Well, we are right at time, so we're just going to wrap up. Huge thank you to Shoni Britton. That was a very thoughtful and practical session. I think we all walked away with some amazing tips, and that's going to benefit everyone, no matter where you are in your career. Couple quick reminders before we go. Our monthly September flow meeting is canceled because we will all be at Clean Currents and hope to see you there. Make sure you post for National Hydropower Day on Monday, August 24th using hashtag HydroDay. And then register for the Flow networking event at Clean Currents Wednesday, September 23rd at Champaign Lanes. And lastly, save the date for Flow in Nashville at NHA's Southeast Regional Meeting, December 9th through 10th. Thanks again, everyone. Appreciate you being here, and we hope to see you at one of our upcoming events. Have a great day. Bye.